Hello and welcome to the St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles podcast. Each episode will bring you the latest news from the St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles, as well as fascinating interviews with entertainment personalities, government leaders, and community advocates. St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles, where Scotland meets the City of Angels. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to the St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles' podcast. I'm your host, Joanna Lewis, and today we have an amazing show lined up for you. First, I'd love to introduce you to our co-host and moderator for this week's episode, Mr. Richard Sparks. Richard Sparks is an alumni of Oxford University and has written extensively for television, film, radio, and stage. Please welcome director, author, entrepreneur, Richard Sparks.
Hello.
And our guest today, which I'm really excited for, Alex Boyd. Alex Boyd is a landscape and documentary photographer whose work primarily focuses on the Scottish landscape. Alex's work has been widely exhibited internationally with solo exhibitions at the Scottish Parliament, as well as group exhibitions at the Royal Academy, Royal Ulster Academy, and the Royal Scottish Academy. His work is featured in the National Galleries of Scotland, the Royal Photographic Society, the Yale Centre for British Arts, and Yale University. His first book, St. Kilda, The Silent Islands, was recently shortlisted for a Saltire Award. His second book, The Isle of Rust, a collaboration, was named one of the best photography books of the year by the Scotsman publication. Alex is currently working on a selection of new books on the Faroe Islands, the Outer Hebrides. Please welcome photographer, writer, and printmaker Alex Boyd. Thank you both, gentlemen, for coming on the show today.
It's good to be here.
Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you so much.
I really miss England, and I go back there a lot. And I'm looking at your pictures of Scotland. It reminds me of many days up there and happy times, camping and traveling around and just the wilderness of the place. Mm-hmm. And I kind of missed it. Can you tell me what it is about that wide empty space of Scotland that is so unique?
I think those kind of wide open landscapes are kind of they seem like an escape for a lot of people. They kind of they have a wildness to them, which I can understand is very attractive. There's the idea of these large glens which go on to the horizon, and these kind of untamed mountainscapes, and the deep lochs and the rivers, and so much song and poetry, bardic poetry attached to these places that I can see the romance. Yeah, I think we all live in, well, not all of us, but many of us live in cities now. And when we live in cities, we just kind of yearn for these places where maybe we can just sort of, just have some space for not just, physical space, but also mental space, just to kind of unwind and kind of center ourselves. And Scotland, I think, for a lot of people is that kind of place where they can kind of just sort of, can breathe a little bit, So yeah, perhaps that's what it is.
Yeah. I mean, when I'm there, I always feel I've come home to some extent. I'm English, and I've probably spent maybe 100 days of my life in Scotland. But there's a real sense of belonging when I get there, and then when I go home, I belong there as well. But is there one place you feel you belong more than the other, the city or the wilderness?
I don't know. I've actively tried not to live in cities all my life. Oh. So I've lived on Isle of Lewis and Harris. I lived there for a couple of years in a small village on the west coast. I've lived on Isle of Skye for a year. I live here in Ayrshire just now, which is not the busiest part of the world, and I live right by the sea. I have lived in cities previously, but I try to kind of run away from there. There's more space for reflection, especially with what I do. If I want to go into a city, I can go to galleries and so on and get that cultural kick. But then if I want to actually do things, I need that space, which you're kind of afforded in living in either remote or kind of quiet villages, so.
I'd hesitate to buttonhole you, but one of the labels I would give you is a wilderness photographer.
Right. Okay.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and I really just like those big, wide open spaces you get. I mean, there's a sense of, I don't know if you know the Canadian painter Lauren Harris,
Mhm.
or obviously you know Ansel Adams.
Yes, of
But
course.
there's
Yeah.
a sense of that majesty. There's what you're looking for. Do you like the size of the places you
Yeah. I
photograph?
mean, I think I was originally born in Germany, but my father's Scottish. But I've lived here most of my life, and I've kind of spent most of my life trying to figure out what places like Scotland are. So you start with the big landscape. You kind of take the Ansel Adams, as you mentioned, kind of big picture, and then just try to get smaller from there on in. So when I went to somewhere like Glencoe, which is probably one of the more famous Scottish, big open landscapes with mountains
Mm.
at the end. I tried to kind of drill down on the histories of these places and maybe try and tell some of the stories around them. So they go from being kind of wild, unknown places to places with quite intimate histories. And I think, a wilderness photographer, I'm happy enough with that label. I'm also trying to kind of unpick some of that, try and unpick some of the
Yeah.
romantic Scotland to kind of actually tell the kind of the layerings which go on in those places, so they're no longer kind of big open empty landscapes. They're places where things happened or people lived, or people had to leave behind. So yeah, it's a complex relationship I've got with the landscape. I'm still trying to work it out.
That seems like I've picked a really good place to start. I said I hesitate to give you one label because
Yeah.
you look at a photograph of, I think it was in St Kilda, of the downed airplane
Mm-hmm.
of the Second World War, which had cost the lives of various New Zealand and Australian and British flyers were killed in and that one shot of the remains of the airplane in the middle of St Kilda is very, that's a story. That's not
Yeah, and
bewildering, is it?
no, that's the thing. I'm really interested in the idea of other narratives. So, for example, Scotland has a very, very well known, very well promoted narrative, which is you've got programs like Outlander, which tell the story of kind of perhaps the the Jacobites, and kind of the struggles against perhaps the British Army at that point, the Lowland forces. But there are other stories in Scotland as well. And you mentioned St Kilda. Yeah, I spent quite a while out there. It's very well known for one story, which is the evacuation of the island. I'm also interested in other stories, such as these poor airmen who lost their lives, or the continuing story of the island. I think the problem with a lot of Scottish history or ideas around Scotland is that time has just stopped. It never did stop. And sometimes I think the problem can be that people from outside, or people who view Scotland, have this kind of backward view of it. Well, we are very much living in the present. We want to look at lots of different layers of Scottish history and contemporary stories and kind of try and tell those as well. That's the thing, and we're having big conversations here just now in Scotland because we have, for example, in our cities, a lot of our streets, are named after slave owners, for example. And now we're starting to go, well, these grand buildings which are in the middle of Glasgow and Edinburgh, and these statues, why were they placed there? Why are we celebrating these men, for example? And should we be recontextualizing those? Should we be talking about those histories? Because until fairly recently, Scotland has kind of had a certain view of its own history, which is very much in some quarters that we're an oppressed nation. But in many ways, Scotland has gone out and done that to the world, as part of the British Empire. Now we're trying to have a very real conversation about that. There's a big argument here that we should destroy these statues, but there's also a counter argument that well, you don't destroy a statue, you recontextualize it. You don't put these people on altars. You don't put them on pedestals. You take them down and you tell people the story of what happened. You don't airbrush it. I'm doing a doctorate just now, and a lot of it looks at trauma. And so I'm doing it as a photography PhD, but I'm looking at the Highland clearances as part of that. And it's about having that discussion, where, people, Scots were, many of them were forced off their land, to the very edges of the land. They're taken from their crofts and forced to live, by the sea. And once they couldn't live there, they were, in many cases, put on ships and then sent over to the Americas or Australia. I mean, the whole Scottish landscape, as we think of it, those big empty spaces, they were places which were cultivated by people, or, across the whole of Scotland, we had the Great Caledonian, the Great Caledonian Forest.
Yeah, I know.
We're trying to replant. It's going to take a while.
It will.
But as you mentioned, sheep. I mean, sheep replace people here, in a major way.
Yeah.
I mean, I've spent a lot of time in, the smaller Scottish islands like Raasay off of Skye, which is famous for a place called Halig, which was written about by the poet Sorley MacLean, who's kind of one of the greatest Gaelic poets. And people are watching this, haven't heard of Sorley MacLean, please go seek his work out. He's one of the great Gaelic bards. And this poem, Halig, tells the story of the clearance of this village on Raasay and how those people were replaced, And I've been there many times. It's quite a moving place. The stone outlines of the houses are still there and the sheep are still there. And it's quite a moving piece. And there's places like that all over Scotland. I live down here in the south of Scotland on the coast, and we talk about the Highland clearances, but there were lowland clearances as well. So the whole country, people were just sort of moved around, and then in many cases moved overseas, and then they themselves who had undergone that did that to people in the countries they went to. So that trauma was carried on.
I was interested in your use of tintypes and the way that they give the landscapes a very historical feel. Is that something you discovered by accident, or were you aiming for it?
No, I've always had an interest in historic photography. The American photographer Sally Mann is someone I've got a lot of respect for. And about 10 years ago, I went to her exhibition, which showed images of Virginia, where she's from. And I'd also known a lot of early Scottish photographers who used these processes. So I was kind of inspired and went to learn at a workshop how to do this. And, I got so far, and then eventually I got a fellowship, a Sir Winston Churchill fellowship, which then took me to America. And I spent a month and a half going to 10 US cities, including LA, training under kind of American masters, because America is really, much further ahead than we are in terms of this kind of thing. So I went up to where was it, Santa Monica, and spent some time there with a guy called Luther Gerlach. He does a lot of stuff with the Getty. Then I went out to the East Coast, up to Rochester, and spent some time with a man who lives up in the woods. Has like a horse-drawn cart and lives in the ways of the Old West. And they helped teach me a lot of these processes. So it's I came back to Scotland, with this kind of new knowledge. And I really wanted to kind of figure out how these early photographers in Scotland worked, how they made those images of the landscape, and how that's kind of, keeps telling a story today where we view Scotland as big, empty landscapes. And that's really from the birth of photography, where you had these people who are selling images to tourists of Scotland as a place which is empty, and it's empty for a reason, as we've discussed, the Highlands. And today I was doing a thing with the BBC. I was up in Argyll shooting a program which was on George Washington Wilson, who's one of the first kind of Scottish photographers who made those kind of works. He ended up, in 5 years, he sold 500,000 images, which went all around the world. And he's one of the people who's responsible for this, the view we have of Scotland today. And I want to kind of unpick that. Why do we have this certain view of our country? So tintypes and these old processes was the way of doing it. Yeah.
So, well, that's a really nice way to approach a subject. One of the reasons we have a view of Scotland like that is, of course, there's nowhere else like it. I mean, if you wanted to do street art, you could do street art in, as you said, Santa Monica or London or Glasgow or anything. But Scotland's got a uniqueness about it. And okay, well, let's go a bit further north. Faroes. Tell us about your trips to the Faroes. Those are fascinating.
So I spent a couple of months in total there. I actually met my wife there, strangely enough, who's Australian. So it's a bit of an odd one. But
mine's American, so we both married out.
Okay, yes, well. Well, I went, the first time I went out there was to spend a month on a sailing vessel. And the idea was to sail, because the Faroe Islands, they're halfway between Iceland and Scotland. They're Scotland's one of our nearest neighbours. But Scots really don't know anything about the Faroe Islands, other than they like to hunt whales, which is kind of the main thing people know about the Faroes. So I decided that I wanted to learn for myself, and maybe make some work while I was there. So yeah, I went out there and spent a month on a boat, a 110-year-old fishing boat called the Johanna. Yeah, so we're there for a month, and we sailed around all these islands and met people, because the crew were Faroese, and having a Faroese crew with you who are introducing you to people and introducing to experiences is a bit different, to then just stepping off a plane and just taking pictures of people. I tried to build relationships in that first trip where I could get to know people.
Have you been back?
Yeah, that's what happened. So I went there for a month, and then I subsequently went back the next year for longer, spending time working directly with Faroese families, working with artists such as Throndur Patterson, who's quite a famous artist who travelled with the English explorer Tim Severin.
Oh yeah, the Brendan voice.
So I met artists, I met politicians, I met actors, I met people just with their families, and spend time with them, have dinner with them, get to know them a bit, photograph them, photograph the landscapes, climb the mountains, of course, and just kind of try to build up a relationship. Because I think I get annoyed when people come here and just take pictures and then produce a book, for example, and they've only they just stepped off the plane. It's the same thing, if I went to the States and made a book on, I don't know, pick a town, any town in America, and pretended to be an authority of it, I think that would be problematic. So I try to kind of cultivate relationships, and I'm still talking to those people now.
This takes us back to the idea of wilderness and travel rather than tourism, because tourism, you get on a plane, you get off, and to go and sit in a beach resort for a week would drive my wife and me up the wall. I mean, I just couldn't bear it. So we've backpacked around Southeast Asia and Papua New Guinea and places like that when we were younger. And you travel slowly and you get to meet people, and you don't know where you're going and well, let's go down there for a few days and see what happens. And that's a different type of thing. And that's what I get from your photography. I get a sense when I'm looking at your Glen pictures of what's beyond it. I want to go and find out what's beyond that. What's next?
That's very kind. I mean, what you've described, what you did previously is something that's very hard to do today, because, you see somewhere like the Faroe Islands or Iceland or, even LA. It's somewhere that it's very hard to see for the first time, because you already know it through Instagram or through media or, when I was in LA, I was like, oh, I know that place. Oh, I know that place. I know that place, because I've seen them all, on television, or in movies. And Scotland's perhaps the same. In Scotland, they don't really show the programme Outlander. People here don't really know Outlander, which might come as a shock to you. But when I've been to, I've been to Australia and I've been to North America on a number of times, and people talk to me about Outlander. I don't know what they're talking about because I've never seen it. But many people abroad have a very fixed idea on what Scotland is from programs like that. So because you have to then try and unpick that, you have to go from you always start from cliches and you try to wind back from there.
That's
and
exactly where I was going with that. That's the same point. Well,
yeah. But I think those cliches are really interesting, and trying to work out why those are so resonant. I mean, my wife was driven crazy by my view of Australia, because in Britain, for example, where Australia is always shown as crocodiles and Australia's 100 deadliest animals. It was interesting going there and realizing I don't know a damn thing about Australia. I got there and
that's the real traveling, rather than your Instagram or your preconception.
Very much so. I mean, we're so fixated on in terms of appearances and how things are, that you have a very strange view of the world through Instagram. And kind of getting a real whatever real means from a philosophical sense. Having actual engagement with people on the ground and spending time with people, that's how you do it. Yeah, I mean, there's no perfect way of viewing a place. It's all subjective. So no one's experience is wrong.
That's great for a photographer, because a photographer's got a unique point of view. I mean, a tourist photographer will always have one of your pieces in Sky. You mentioned this is a very popular spot for photographs. So I'm sure a lot of people go and photograph that, but there are many other places that you will find in the area that'll give you your view of the place.
Well, I'll give you an example of that. One of the most famous places in Skye is a rock formation called the Old Man of Storr.
Oh, yeah.
And it's this huge pinnacle which rises, from the edge of a cliff. You can see it from miles around. It looks like something out of a nightmare, like a fang, rising out of the land. And tourists go up there, in their thousands and thousands. You can barely park near there. The roads are so congested. Anyway, it's a great Instagram, location. But you go up there and people walk, because they've seen the route, they walk up to it, around it, and then they come back down. But no one will go off that path. Mm-hmm. And when I lived on Skye, I would go up there, go to the store, and then I'd walk 3 or 4 minutes under the cliffs and around and up up part of a precipice, and I'd sit there and I'd see no one for hours. Literally 3, 4, 5 minute walk away, and I just watch people do the same guided walk, but not actually looking. There's a corrie beside there called Corrie Nymphola, which means corrie of the fool. Sorry if my Gaelic was wrong there. And I stood in the fool's corrie for hours, photographing the landscape from this perspective I'd never seen, because it's not on Instagram. It's not in books. And since I've gone there and since I've shared images of that, people now write to me and say, "Where did you take that?" And now I start to see those images appearing on social media. So it's an odd one, And I'm not saying I invented that shot or that view. That's
because you kind of brought up Instagram, and is there kind of a push and pull between photographers and quote unquote Instagram photographers? And what are your thoughts on these people who are looking at photography through the lens of a cell phone?
Yeah, I mean, the minute you put something up to your face, like a camera or a cell phone, you're creating a barrier already. So that's the first of your kind of, the first point of departure away from whatever's in front of you. So you start to frame that subject, and it's the final output. So if you're doing a cell phone and you're doing something for Instagram, what are you actually doing? And in many cases with Instagram, it's performative. You're having this performance where you want to tell a story. And recently I was up in Cape Wrath about 2 months ago, which is the most remote northwest part of Scotland. You have to get a ferry into there, and then it's a 16-mile cycle along this quite terrible terrain to get in there. And I went up there and I stayed in a bothy, which is a place which is there's no toilet, there's you just have to get a fire going, you keep warm by sharing a few whiskies. So it's a beautiful place, a remote beach. It's the Scotland that people dream of. I'd recommend that Cape Wrath bothy to anyone. But anyway, I was there, and it's a very, very quiet, peaceful place. And I got home and I went on Instagram to find pictures of it, and there's people like doing photo shoots there, in like full tweed suits and looking off into the majestic sunset. And it's not the kind of place where you could do that. They've clearly gone into this muddy landscape terrain with a bag full of gear and to do a photo shoot. And I feel they're kind of just missing the point of the whole place, which is this great wilderness to just have peace and quiet and appreciate this wild Atlantic rolling into the west of Scotland, and not do it to sell whatever on earth they're trying to sell. So their lifestyle basically. So yeah, in Scotland we have a great tension with Instagram, because people come here and treat Scotland like a playground. I personally have big issues with that, but I understand why people do it, because it's a beautiful country. In Skye, for example, stunning big vistas. You want to take pictures of your car or your family in front of it. You want to, if you've come from the States, for example, and you come on to holiday in Scotland, you want to do that because you want to tell that story. So I understand why people do it, 100%. It's the same, when I went out to LA or whatever, I'm doing all the stuff that I hate when people do when they come here. So I'm a hypocrite as well.
Maybe we all just have to start somewhere. There's that new book, The Land of My Desire.
That's a series of work I made up on Lewis, which was gravures, so they're actual prints. That will be part of a book at some point. My to-do list is colossal.
Yeah.
But every image I make, I take a photograph and then I etch it into a plate, and then I put that through a printing press. It's quite a long process, so that book will probably take years to come out, because I'll need to hand print every image for it. But yeah, I was trying to kind of show a side of Scotland, which again perhaps isn't seen so much, which is, yeah, that was the Peat Moorland in the middle of Lewis. And it's because, you know, these places, people go up mountains in Scotland or people go to the sea, but places like the Peat Moorlands, they're a nightmare to walk over. I mean, can you imagine walking over like a bog?
I've done it.
Well, if you've done it, then you'll know that, you know, walking 5 miles over a peat moor is treacherous. You know, I walked when I went to take those images. You know, I walked with a woman whose family had lived in that part of Scotland for hundreds of years. They had sheilings on the moor, and sheilings are these. For those who don't know, sheilings, they're small stone structures out on the moorland. And during the summer, for hundreds of years, even longer, you know, they're from I think, is it Neolithic? I'm trying to remember perhaps thousands of years old, when people used to move around. You know, they used to live in the moors during the summer, and they'd live by the coast in the winter to fish. But anyway, that aside, her family had been there for hundreds of years at least, and she knew that land, you know, like the back of her hand. So I followed this woman, Anne Campbell, across the moors, across these hidden rivers, past these treacherous bogs, you know, where she had learned to avoid, because you step onto this land, you go up to your chest immediately. And I navigated with her through all kinds of weather and took those images, you know, and that's the kind of knowledge you don't get on Instagram because you know, there's no map across that landscape other than, you know, the map of experience, you know. And it's forever changing in slightly subtle ways. And yeah, those are the places which really interest me, those kind of hidden histories, where you need someone who's got that really specific local knowledge to kind of survive in an environment like that. Yeah,
you definitely caught. I mean, you caught the sort of the space there. I think there's particularly beautiful pictures. And I'm interested in the title, The Land of My Desire, because there's nobody in it but you. It's just empty. Is your desire, the poet Andrew Marvell said, two paradises twere in one, to live in paradise alone. Is your idea of the land of your desire to be completely alone in solitude in the wilderness?
I don't know. I don't think you're ever really alone in the landscape. I mean, you're kind of there with, I don't believe in the paranormal, but you're kind of there with the ghosts of those who've been there before, you know. So I like to reflect on that whenever I'm somewhere. Yeah, I like to share the experience. You know, quite often those images I make with someone with me, but yeah, to be selfish, I do like to go out into the mountains alone, you know, and spend time in those places alone. There can be kind of a heightened sense, you know, if I go into the mountains alone, you know, there's that slightly, you know, it can be treacherous environments. So I actually quite like having that oppressive fear upon me when I'm going into the Scottish mountains, which, you know, if you've got someone else with you, it kind of takes that away. But I like having that. I mean, this town where I live just now, Irvine, it's very famous because Edgar Allan Poe used to live here. So it's kind of got a real gothic vibe to it, I suppose. You know, going to Skye, for example, or anywhere on the west coast and in Ireland, and seeing when waterfalls run over the edge of cliffs and then the waterfalls come back up on themselves because the winds are so high.
Yeah.
It's quite something to observe. But yeah, I mean, it's part of the people here, you know. I think the weather here does have a huge effect on our temperament as Scots or as Celts, you know, if we talk about the Irish as well. And, you know, that it does kind of work, the kind of humor, everything, you know, is very much from that. And, you know, there's a good book which came out recently on Shetland, I think, which looks at, you know, how how the weather of Scotland has, keeps people together indoors. And that's
Yeah.
where, the storytelling traditions come from, that, during those long winters we have here, people kind of get together and they have ceilidhs and, tell stories and drink, and how that's then affected how we see the world around us is through this strong community thing, because we have to be brought together to survive in those winter months. And, I thought those are the old tales from, the past. Then moving from here in the south of Scotland up to the islands, which are, the winters there are very harsh indeed. I mean, when I was living up in Braga on the west coast of Lewis, the winds were like 110, 120 miles per hour over my house at night. It's like a train running over your house at night. Driving to work over these huge moors, with the wind just, they're harsh environments to live in. And, you need a strong community there. And in places like that, you feel you do feel those old links where people come together, they all descend on the house, and, in some cases an accordion and some whiskey comes out, and, you can see those long things from Scottish history, and culture coming together. It's lovely. Yeah.
Well,
Any story that you've heard inspired you to go somewhere and take pictures of an area?
I think the St Kilda story was the one that really drove me there. It's the story of St Kilda, which, if your viewers don't know it, and I'm sure everyone does know St Kilda, but there are these islands which are 100 miles west of the Scottish mainland, and people have lived there since, at least the Viking era. And these islands, they're part of a ruined, a collapsed volcano. So again, they come out of the sea dramatically, these pinnacles, and there's one central island called Hirta. And people have lived there for millennia. And in the 1930s, life got too hard for them. They learned about the outside world in a way which showed there were comforts. Things like people had died there, and medicine could maybe have saved them. And they decided as a community to come together one last time and leave. So one day a ship arrived in 1930 in the bay at Hirta and took the entire community away for the last time. And, the ruins of those houses are still there today. And I always wanted to go and see this island, which is so famous for this, where the community, as they left the island, they left their Bibles open on the table, in every home, and they left, like a small offering, and then they locked their doors for the last time and left. And that's such an iconic story in Scotland of the end of this community, that, I needed to know what happened, after that. So yeah, I traveled there years ago to kind of take some images of those houses. And, I also knew this other story that, those people all left, and the islands, they've passed into history as this great, sad story, where these people survived in this very harsh environment for millennia. And the military actually moved in 20 years later and took over the islands and turned it into like this Cold War base. It was this kind of, in the middle of the Cold War between, Russian submarines coming around and everything, So I needed to know how those two stories came together, how they kind of, how does this modern military base sit alongside this very sad story? So yeah, that story took me out there, and I spent, I went several times there. I camped there, spent time with my wife there, and tried to kind of unpick the story of that. But that's probably the major story. But yeah, Ireland was the same. You hear, you're brought up being told stories of local folklore. Like we share a story of Ec Uisce, which means the water horse. The story of this water horse which rises from the lochs and takes people, down to their watery doom. And we have this story all over Scotland, and it's a story which kind of goes all over the place. So I always wanted to go and see where these water horses, rose. So I documented some of those sites, and yeah, we have lots of legends and myths, which, I've always wanted to kind of dig down, why did those take place there, yeah. So
you had one photograph in the Faroe Islands of a Faroe Islander dressed up as not a skelpie, because it was a different word in Norse, but it was a spirit of the land type of thing.
Like the stories here, we people think of fairies as things with little wings, because of the whole Disneyfication of the world. But here in the Celtic world, fairies are Shean. They're the dead. They're the spirits of the dead, and they, in many cases, like to mess with you. And Hultafolk. That's what she's called. And we share in the Nordic world. We have these archetypical stories of the people who live in the landscape. Well, they're not people; they're spirits. And you don't want to
in the rocks in Iceland. In the rocks, you don't move the rocks because they're home to.
Well, that's the thing. Like you mentioned, Eris. I was in the west of Ireland there, and I'd go into a bar and. You're from Scotland, and you hope they don't wind you up in the same way they might wind up people from elsewhere. But they say to you, don't go and photograph there, because that's a fairy place. That's somewhere where humans should not disturb. You've got to be respectful of that. Don't go there. And I thought, people are just trying to wind me up. And more I travel, go to bars. This is a common story in my life. And meet people, and you get the same stories. And then here it's the same. There are certain places where which have those kind of ties. Where people get strange feelings. When they're working in the land, and in Ireland I felt that especially.
Do you use Photoshop on them or things like that post production?
Not really. I mean, I try to get as much of it in the camera as possible, and that's because I want to know that it's a good shot when I make it. So when I was taking portraits of people, I tend to shoot them on film, but sometimes I'll do it on digital to show them the result. But I want it to be as close to how I'd print it as possible. And that's not because I'm afraid of Photoshop. It's because I'm lazy and I don't want to do lots of editing. I don't want to spend hours of my life in front of a computer.
Well, the question I'd like to ask Alex is, where are you going next? What's on the horizon for you?
Well, I've spent so much time in Scotland, making work, responding to the landscape here, that I'd actually like to maybe see the places where Scots went, abroad. So America really, really interests me in terms of where Scots went and settled and how they viewed those landscapes. So I'd love to do work there. But Australia especially interests me. I mean, imagine leaving cold, wet Scotland and going to this place, which is complete opposite. Everything's turned up till 11. The light, the bird sound, everything's so different. I'd like to kind of go to these places and kind of try to find my way. Once we can fly again, which would be great, I'd like to go and spend some time in the southwest of Australia, for example, and work with the Noongar people who have been the kind of the custodians of the land in Australia for millennia, and work with the community there, and just shut up, watch and listen, and kind of see how they've looked after the land and how they live today, and then maybe work with them and trying to sort of find my own way in there. But all my experiences in Scotland have kind of tried to show me that I need to kind of maybe, when I go somewhere else, to step back and see how that then affects what I do. So maybe starting to move abroad a little bit, like all Scots do. You start off in Scotland and then you end up, reaching out across the world. So that's the next plan, really, I guess.
Well, fantastic. Thank you both so much for being on the show today. Richard, thank you so much for being our guest host. And
you're welcome. Thank you.
And Alex, thanks again. It was so insightful. I've had a fantastic time with you. And if there is a website, and I know we've got a book that we want to mention also during this podcast, so we can do that right now.
Okay. I brought a book last year with Jonathan Meades, who's an English writer, critic, architectural mastermind called Isle of Rust, which is about the Outer Hebrides. You can get that from my website or my publisher, but I'm at alexboyd.co.uk or alexboydphotography.com. I'm also on Twitter at Alex Boyd. That's the thing that I've got all the kind of social media stuff there. Yeah.
Thanks again, guys, so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the St. Andrews Society of Los Angeles podcast. For more information on the St. Andrews Society of Los Angeles, visit www.standrewsla.org. And don't forget to like our Facebook page, Instagram, and YouTube channels as well. Have a great week, and we'll see you next episode.